Welcome back, everyone, to part 3 of the Great Northern War. This episode is titled Young and Violent. Just a couple quick things in response to yesterday's episode. Number one of the things that we talked about yesterday was Charles the 12th, Karl the 12th, for those of you in Sweden, of course, but in English-speaking countries, Karl is Charles. Charles the 12th. There's the story of him holding open the door and yelling, open up and things like that. There's no actual historical record of that actually happening. That's probably one of those legend type things that has been told about him that seems completely consistent with his character based on everything we know about the man. Probably did not happen, or at least it seems from the historical record to have probably not happened. That doesn't take away from the kind of guy he was. It's just one of those really cool stories that's probably just that, a story. But that said, we're ready to dive into part 3. And I asked you yesterday for some recommendations for some biographies, and apparently, as many of you pointed out, Voltaire did a biography, obviously in the French language, about Karl XII. That I may see if I can find a good English translation of. But it seems like there's a couple of other really good books out there that I may dive into about this story. Here we go, part 3.
Two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair northern Europe. Wait a minute.
That was similar to the introduction to Romeo and Juliet.
With Poland-Lithuania out of the fight, Charles XII sets his eyes on another foe, the Russian giant, Peter the Great. While Charles had run roughshod over Poland, Peter had taken advantage. And
by giant, he's not just talking about the country. Peter the Great was 6'8", which 6'8" is really tall now, but 300-400 years ago, that's a good 14 inches taller than the average height at the time. It's ridiculous how huge this guy was.
Advantage of the moment to once again assail the Baltic provinces. He was stopped short of his ultimate goal, but Peter's efforts there were not without gain. His armies carved a path all the way to the Swedish fortress of Nystrom, which he tore down to build an even greater fortress, the Peter and Paul fortress, which would serve as the cornerstone for his most ambitious project of all, St. Petersburg.
So my man, before he even really had the rightful claim to the land, builds St. Petersburg, which becomes the capital of the Russian Empire, in land that was technically still owned by Sweden at the time. It wasn't given over to Russia in some treaty or anything like that. He just took the land and then built this massive capital in it. It's a gutsy thing to do. So we've got two really larger-than-life characters in Charles XII and Peter the Great.
He would erect a new city here, one grander and more modern than anything Russia had ever seen. This would be his gateway to the West, his port that tied Russia into the economic life of Europe. It would be his new capital, on which he would spare no expense, in treasure or lives. This was to be the culmination of his legacy, the embodiment of all his ideas on westernizing Russia, on becoming a naval power, on embracing European art and science and culture.
So remember, we talked about this in episode 1. Peter the Great's big thing is that he wants to modernize Russia in the vein of the Western powers, places like France and Britain. He's been there. He's seen the future. He's seen that this is the direction he needs to take his new empire. And so he wants to do this. And what better way to do that than to build an entirely new city that not only gives you your first real access to the seas of the north, which is going to allow for trade with places like Prussia and Britain and others. So it's a great way to get that started.
But for that to be the case, Russia would have to succeed in holding on to these gains, something that Charles XII could not abide. Throughout 1704 and 1705, Swedish forces tried to take Peter's great fortress, but time and again they were repelled. Soon costs started to mount, and men that could ill afford to be lost died for little gain. So Charles revamped his strategy and blockaded St. Petersburg. While the blockade dragged on, he began marshalling his main force for a march to the east. It was at this point that Russia sent him a peace offer. In return for an armistice, Russia would give up all of their gains, except for St. Petersburg and the forts connecting it to Russian territory. But Charles was having none of it. He knew how important St. Petersburg was. Why, with his invincible army, should he give it up? So Charles marched east, braving horrible weather and dangerous crossings to move with his traditional lightning speed. As he pressed forward, Peter fell back and back. Each defensive line Peter's commanders had planned to entrench was taken before their men could even unpack their spades.
So this is the same strategy that Russia will use against Napoleon a couple of centuries later. Well, a century later. Pull back, pull back, pull back. Draw them deeper and deeper into Russia. Russia's huge. Russia's got people everywhere. Russia's cold in the winter. It's really harsh in the winter. So you've got the luxury of being able to draw them further and further into your territory. And that's what, in the end, destroyed Napoleon. And they're going to try and do this strategy here.
But even this march could not make up for the time Charles had lost trying to make Poland support his puppet king. In the years that had followed his initial victories over the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian forces, Russia had not only seized and fortified what would become St. Petersburg, but reinforced it, and kept reinforcing it. Yet, the Swedish army was strong.
So, people were asking yesterday, well, what's the point of the Poland-Lithuania / Saxony this group of soldiers pulling back. Why does Augustus keep losing, and why does that matter? Well, why it matters is that it kept Charles's attention focused on trying to stabilize things there, while over here behind him, Peter the Great's doing his thing, building up St. Petersburg, taking that territory and making it impossible to take back. That's why it mattered. And the thing with Sweden is they've got this very effective professional army, but they don't have a lot of men. It's a small country population-wise, even though they're a great power. And so it's not just that easy to replace these men as you lose them. And, the majority of these men are lost to disease. And so just marching around, even if you're not fighting battles, you're losing men. Same thing with Napoleon. The vast majority of his army, this massive army that he had, was not lost fighting in battles. It was lost to the elements.
King was able, their officers daring and intelligent. Top members of the military thought that it would be a tough fight, but that they could take St. Petersburg. They drew up plans and submitted them to the king, who swore them to utmost secrecy about the plans they had concocted. And so the officers marched, thinking their objective to be St. Petersburg. But soon they found themselves near Minsk. Wait a minute, that wasn't on the way to St. Petersburg. Charles had marched them in a different direction, and there was only one place they could be going from there. He was marching them to Moscow. Charles's officers had told him that they were not ready, that striking so deep into Russia was simply too great of a gamble. It was something the army simply wasn't prepared for. But how many times before had Charles been told that something was too great a gamble? How often had he heard that something was impossible, only to then achieve it himself?
So let's talk about parallels for a minute, because this is something that happens throughout history with somebody who wins against long odds over and over again. They start to think themselves invincible. Think Robert E. Lee in the aftermath of the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he faces his longest odds and wins. He marches into Gettysburg and launches this impossible attack on July 3rd that we know as Pickett's Charge. Everybody around him knew that it was doomed to fail, but Lee had this sense of invincibility because they had won so many times before in situations like that. And that's going to be the downfall here as well.
He had made up his mind. They would not waste their time retaking lost territories. He would unseat Peter himself. The first two rivers they crossed with little opposition, being slowed only by the fact that the retreating Russian forces burnt every bridge along the way. Tartar horsemen also harassed them continually, but this seemed a minor nuisance. They were making good time through bad country. But then, at the Wabis River, they found a large enemy force barring their passage. The position held by the Russians was daunting. The Swedes would have to traverse marshy ground to get to them, and beyond that was a forest which might hide yet more troops. But Charles saw a way. The enemy line had a gap in it along a swampy area that the Russians clearly thought was impassable. Charles personally led his army across 1,500 yards of killing ground to reach this swampy area. At one point,
once again, personally leading, taking the lead, taking the initiative, being out front, showing no fear, inspiring your men.
his men were shoulder deep in water. The enemy
Wow.
line was split. The Russians tried to use numbers to heal the breach, but heroic actions from the Swedish cavalry prevented any joining of Russian arms. Soon the line began to collapse. The crossing was theirs. Once again, the Swedes had triumphed against impossible odds. But keen observers in the army would have noted that though the Swedes emerged victorious, these Russian troops were made of sterner stuff than they had been 8 years back. Tactics and firm soldiering had been hammered into them since their retreat at Narva. They would not be turning and running like that anymore. This victory left Charles's army exhausted. It would take a month of rest before he could really move them again. And during this month, Peter was not idle. Peter stripped the land bare. He laid waste to any stretch of ground that the Swedes would have to cross.
And this is, again, a brilliant strategy because you've got an army that's deep in enemy territory that's got to live off the land. There's no way they're able to take all the supplies they need with them. And so you strip them of anything that they can use to sustain their forces. That's really the best thing you can do.
And even though it was his own country, and the suffering caused to his own people was immense, Peter made no half measure of it. Every grain of wheat was carted off. Every pasture where a horse might graze was turned to ash. There would be no...
This was actually a strategy, I believe, that was used by the Gauls against Julius Caesar. And so I would guess that's probably one of the places that Peter got this idea from.
Nothing but wasteland for the Swedes to traverse. Thus began a time of suffering for the Swedish forces. When they resumed their march, food was scarce, and with scarce food came disease. This victorious army began to march as defeated men, with hollow eyes and weary steps. Charles continued to rally them, but he had no real answer to this predicament. He had been counting on living off the countryside as they marched. Their supply lines were stretched beyond their limit. Many asked him to turn home, but he believed in Swedish arms. He believed that if he could just force Peter into one decisive battle, they might yet win this war.
Well, that's what he wants, is a decisive battle, which is exactly why Peter's not going to give it to him. Another example that this happened is in the Mexican War or the Texas War for Independence, where they just kept pulling back. Texas did, pulling back. All Santa Anna wanted. Santa Anna wants this decisive battle where he can defeat them, and they won't let him have it.
But Peter demurred. He would not give Charles the battle he wanted. And so the Swedes marched across fields of ash, seeing always in the distance villages alight, candles in remembrance to Peter's uncompromising policy of starvation. In frustration, Charles turned to his officers and asked their advice. They recommended that the army fall back to the Dnieper and meet up with a relief force laden with supplies. But this would be tantamount to giving up the campaign, so Charles asked for other options. Reluctantly, it was suggested that the Ukraine had not been as thoroughly plundered. It might be possible to gather supplies there and enlist the aid of friendly Cossacks. But such a move would cut the army off from any real ability to communicate with Swedish territory or get resupply from the Empire. Still, Charles saw it as a possible path to victory where retreat offered none. His officers pleaded with him to at least wait for the relief force and their provisions. But Charles, fearing that further delays would only give Peter more time, turned the army toward Ukraine immediately. They would now retrace their steps until they could turn south, walking back across the same blasted waste from which they had just come. But as summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, a chill set in. Then a deep cold. Then a freezing, bone-gnawing frost. And not just any frost. This was what is known today as the Great Frost, the coldest winter Europe has experienced in 500 years.
Of course.
Rivers froze from the Thames all the way down to the lagoons of Venice. And this frost served Peter well. By the time the winter of 1708 and 1709 came to an end, Charles had only 20,000 remaining men able to fight, less than half the number he'd begun this campaign with. Half of his undefeated army lost. But there's still hope yet. Join us next time to find out what happens to his reinforcements, to the Cossacks Charles hopes yet to enlist, and most of all, to the great army of Charles himself, as he and Peter finally square off at the Battle of Poltava.
The Battle of Poltava. I mean, I know how that battle goes, but I won't say anything in case those of you have not seen this yet. I haven't seen the episode, but I know about the battle. So, yeah, this is kind of the Empire Strikes Back moment, right? You know, Charles has been doing really, really well. Now we're leaving things at a very dark moment. Is he going to be able to turn it around and win victory, or is this the beginning of the end for him? I guess we'll find out tomorrow. I've put the link in the description to the original video, as well as to some other things like Patreon, my social media accounts, stuff like that. Check those out. We'll be back tomorrow with the next part. Thanks for watching.